Wyoming Territory, 1878. The wind crossed the prairie, carrying the scent of dry grass and lingering cattle dust from the last drive. Caleb Whitmore stood before the newly built ranch house, hands braced on his hips, eyes narrowed at the pale pine boards still bright out under the sun. The house was the result of 3 years without proper sleep, of endless journeys across distant ground, of winters that bit into flesh. Winters he survived on discipline and stubborn resolve alone. 2,000 acres of land, a private water source, a ranch large enough to make any frontier man believe he had won. But Caleb did not feel victorious. The house stood firm and silent, more evidence than home. No laughter, no smell of cooking, no one waiting for him after a long day. Caleb was used to it. He believed men of the West were not meant to dream. Those who let their hearts outrun their reason tended to die young, killed by drought, by illness, by a wrong decision born from wanting to keep someone close. He had seen enough, and he had learned his lesson. Hoofbeats broke the quiet. Hank, the ranch foreman, pulled up at the porch, his face tight as if carrying bad news. He did not circle the matter. The Cowboys were about to leave. Third time this week the meals were burnt. Coffee bitter as medicine. Bread raw in the middle. The old cook had quit under the pressure, leaving behind a wrecked kitchen and a crew of hungry men. Caleb stayed silent for a moment. He could replace Cowboys, but not an entire crew on the eve of roundup. In the end, he nodded, reluctantly accepting a solution he disliked, hiring a cook from the town of Clearwater. Temporary, he told himself, just to keep the men. Nothing more. 3 days later, while checking the southern fence line, Caleb saw a wagon approaching from a distance. Dust lifted lightly beneath its wheels. Hank held the reins. Beside him sat a woman, back straight, a wide-brimmed hat shading half her face. Caleb knew who she was before the wagon stopped. The new cook, and he expected very little. Women on a ranch were trouble, too fragile or too sensitive, unable to stand the sun and wind, unable to endure loneliness. Caleb removed his hat when the wagon stopped in the yard, more habit than courtesy. "Welcome to Whitmore Ranch," he said, his tone even. The woman lifted her head. In that moment, Caleb realized he had judged too quickly. She did not glance around in fear, nor lower her eyes in avoidance. Her dark eyes met his directly, not in challenge, not in plea. It was a calm look, as if she were measuring land before deciding whether to step onto it. Naomi Brooks. She gave her name in a steady voice, neither soft nor raised. Simple clothing, a dark dress, no jewelry. Everything about her was neat and restrained, yet the way she sat upright and placed her foot on the ground as she stepped down from the wagon showed she was not someone accustomed to living under another's protection. The realization unsettled him. He did not like being looked at as something under consideration. "It's seasonal work," he said, quicker than necessary. "Ranch life isn't easy." Naomi nodded. No argument, no defense. "I'm not looking for easy." The brief reply left him without a response. Hank led her toward the kitchen, leaving Caleb standing there, watching the straight line of her back and the steady pace of the woman who had just stepped into his world. She was only a temporary solution, he reminded himself. A hired hand. 1 season, then gone. But when Naomi stopped at the kitchen steps and turned to look up at the ranch house, longer than necessary, her expression was not that of someone here for work alone. It was the look of someone weighing a lifetime. And that, for reasons Caleb could not explain, made his chest tighten with unease. The kitchen sat apart from the main house, low and dim, like a forgotten limb of the ranch. Naomi Brooks paused at the threshold, one hand still holding the brim of her hat, her eyes moving slowly across the space before her. The air was heavy with old grease and smoke that had settled over time. On the wooden table, flour and coffee grounds lay scattered, stuck together in uneven patches. Cast iron pots were stacked carelessly, their bottoms blackened. The old stove was coated in a thick layer of ash, as if no one had thought to clean it in a long while. Caleb Whitmore stood behind her, shoulder against the doorframe. He was used to this sight. To him, the kitchen was merely a place to put food into men before they went back out to the fields. Nothing more. But the way Naomi stood there, silent, not speaking right away, made something in him bristle, as if the kitchen itself were being judged. "You can start today," Caleb said, his voice firm. "Supper needs to be on time." Naomi turned to look at him. No frown, no sigh, just a direct, steady gaze that made him straighten slightly. "I need 1 day." Caleb lifted an eyebrow. "1 day?" "To clean," she replied, "and to set things right." He gave a short laugh, not out of amusement, but because he was not used to hearing such a request. "You were hired to cook, not to rebuild." Naomi removed her hat and placed it neatly on the table. Light from the small window behind her caught the dark tone of her skin and the solid way she stood. "If you want to keep serving burnt beans and raw bread, I can cook right now. But if you want to keep your men, this kitchen needs to be fixed first." The words were brief, neither submissive nor flattering. Caleb felt the familiar irritation rise, the feeling he got when someone set conditions. He was not accustomed to a person arriving at his ranch and telling him what needed to be done. "My men don't have time to wait," he said. Naomi met his eyes. "They've already waited long enough." Silence settled between them, thick and taut. Caleb realized he was being forced into a choice, not because she raised her voice, but because she did not waver. At last, he turned and called for 2 hands, signaling them to bring water and soap. "1 day," he said, as if conceding something very small. "Just 1 day." Naomi nodded, showing no sign of victory. She rolled up her sleeves, tied her hair back, and began working the moment the first buckets arrived. No complaints, no hesitation. She scrubbed each tabletop, emptied the stove ash, soaked the cast iron pots. Her movements were firm and steady, like someone more familiar with labor than with talk. Caleb walked away, but not far. From outside, he watched Naomi direct the 2 men carrying water, her voice clear, never sharp. When a bucket tipped and spilled, she quietly picked it up, wiped the floor, and continued. Not a single wasted motion. Evening came slowly. Caleb checked the stables, signed a few ledgers, yet his eyes kept drifting back toward the kitchen. When the sky darkened, the oil lamp inside was still burning. He told himself he was only making sure the work stayed on schedule. But when he stepped closer, he stopped at the door. Inside, the kitchen had changed. The clutter was gone. The table surfaces were clean. The pots were stacked in order. Naomi stood at the center of the room, back straight, kneading dough on the table. Her arms tensed with each push, movements sure and unhurried. A loose strand of hair had slipped free, fallen across her forehead, and she did not notice. Caleb stood there, silent. For the first time that day, he did not know what he was supposed to do next. She was only hired help, only a temporary solution. Yet as he turned away, the lamp in the kitchen still glowed behind him, and he realized he was waiting. waiting for that light to go out, though he did not know why. Mornings at Whitmore Ranch usually began in a heavy silence. Men rose by habit, pulled on their boots, stepped out of the bunkhouse with the fatigue of the previous day still written on their faces. They ate quickly, ate to be done with it, then scattered across the pasture like breathing machines. Caleb Whitmore was used to that rhythm. He had built this ranch on discipline, not on feeling. That morning, as Caleb walked toward the kitchen, he stopped in the middle of the yard. The smell of coffee spread through the cool air, full and steady, not sharp, not burnt. The scent of baked bread mixed with searing meat, and his stomach reacted before reason had time to speak. The kitchen door stood slightly open. The oil lamp was still lit, even though the sun was already up. Inside, the long table had been wiped clean. Cups and plates were set in order. Naomi Brooks stood at the stove, her back to the door, turning slices of meat in the pan. She was unhurried, not rushed. Every movement landed at the right moment, as if she were keeping a rhythm of her own that the room had no choice but to follow. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said without turning. "Coffee's ready?" Caleb poured himself a cup. Steam rose, carrying a smell he had not known in a long time. The first sip made him pause. Not bitter, not thin, just right. He said nothing, but Naomi seemed to sense it. She placed bread on the table, each piece evenly browned, not scorched at the edges, not raw inside. The cowboys began to file in. At first, there was caution, then quick glances, then the scrape of chairs, the sound of spoons touching plates. No one spoke loudly, but low murmurs of approval moved through the room like a small wave. One man chuckled softly, another asked for more coffee. Caleb leaned against the wall, watching. He saw faces he knew soften, shoulders eased, backs no longer held rigid the way they did out on the range. They lingered longer than necessary, as if unwilling to leave the table too soon. Naomi moved among them, refilling cups, setting down more bread. She did not smile often, but her gaze rested long enough on each man to let him know he was being seen. Not like hired help, like someone holding order inside a living space. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" a young hand asked. "At home," Naomi replied. "And in the years when making food that people could eat mattered." The answer was simple, yet Caleb heard in it a longer history than she offered. It struck him then. She was not only feeding them, she was resetting the ranch's rhythm, meals on time, food that lasted, an atmosphere quiet enough to remind people they were not alive only to work. As breakfast wound down, Caleb stepped closer. "You managed this with what we had?" Naomi wiped her hands and glanced around the kitchen, fuller now than it had been the night before. "Ingredients don't decide a meal," she said. "Use does." He nodded, did not argue, for the first time since building the ranch, Caleb saw the place as something closer to a home than a temporary stop. The thought unsettled him. Family. He had removed that from his life early on, treating it as a dangerous luxury. His eyes met hers. This time, neither looked away at once. Just a breath held a second longer than usual. A brief pause, but enough for Caleb to understand there were things that could not be kept outside reach forever. "When Hank goes into town," he said quietly, "give him a list of what you need." Naomi looked surprised, then nodded. No thanks. No sign of victory. She accepted it simply, as if it were how things were meant to be. When Caleb stepped back outside, the sun was higher. Whitmore Ranch was still his. The land, the cattle, everything remained in place. But somewhere behind him, in that small kitchen, Something had shifted, and this time he was not certain he wanted to stop it. Whitmore Ranch changed its rhythm quietly, without announcement. No new orders were given. No rules were posted on the walls. Small things simply began to happen on time. Breakfast was no longer swallowed in haste. Supper was no longer an obligation. The men lingered at the table, spoke more, and when they left, they did so with the sense of having been cared for. Naomi Brooks did not try to become the center of things, yet she became the center all the same. She remembered who took their coffee strong, who needed extra bread. She knew who rode out before dawn and who came back after dark. Caleb noticed these details were not part of what she had been hired to do. They were attention, something this ranch had never truly known. One afternoon, while Caleb was reviewing ledgers on the porch, Naomi stood before him, hat in her hands. "There's a small patch of land behind the kitchen," she said. "If you don't mind, I'd like to clear it and plant some vegetables and herbs." Caleb looked up. "You're here to cook." "Fresh produce makes better meals," Naomi replied, "and it saves money." He said nothing. That strip of land had been neglected for years, weeds grown knee-high, but her request made him think of something else. A garden meant waiting. It meant staying long enough to see what you planted grow. "How long do you plan to stay?" he asked, his tone not sharp, but cool. Naomi met his gaze without flinching. "I work by agreement," she said, "but I don't work carelessly." Caleb nodded, as if that answer was sufficient. "Do it," he said, "as long as it doesn't interfere with your duties." Naomi thanked him with a brief nod and turned away. Caleb watched her go, realizing he had just allowed something he had always avoided, a sign of attachment. That evening, rain came without warning, not heavy, but steady, tapping evenly against the tin roof. The men turned in early. The kitchen held only the oil lamp's glow and the sound of rain. Naomi was wiping down the table when Caleb stepped inside. He did not speak at once, only stood there, breathing in the faint smell of bread still lingering in the air. "Would you like more to eat?" Naomi asked, her back to him. "No," Caleb said. "Just checking." She nodded and went on with her work. After a moment, Naomi set the cloth aside and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Sit," she said. Not an invitation, more like a simple suggestion. They sat across from each other, the wooden table between them. The lamp softened Naomi's features, easing the severity Caleb had come to expect. He realized he had never really looked at her this long before. "You don't like rain," Naomi said, as an observation. "It slows the work," Caleb replied. "Or brings things back," she said. He looked at her, slightly surprised. "Do you usually say things like that to your employer?" Naomi did not smile. "Only when I see someone carrying more than they can say." The question lingered. Caleb felt himself standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. "My father believed in family," he said slowly. "He lost everything by believing the wrong people." Naomi nodded, did not press further. "As for me," she said after a moment, "I learned how to stay when it was necessary, and how to leave when there was no other choice." Caleb understood then that this was the first time they had touched each other's pasts, even if only in fragments. Not enough to understand, but enough to know there was something there. The rain continued. The lamp flickered. Caleb stood first, as if to end the moment. "Hank's heading into town next week," he said. "If you want seeds or supplies, I'll have him bring them back." Naomi looked up. "You don't have to do that. Consider it an investment," he said, avoiding her eyes. The ranch needs stability. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then I'll stay a while longer, Naomi said. At least until the garden yields something. Caleb turned away before she could say more. Stay longer, he said, as though reciting a clause. For work. But when he stepped outside, the rain had lightened, and in the glow of the lamp behind him, Caleb Whitmore knew he had just agreed to something whose most important terms had never been spoken. The threat did not arrive like a storm. It came as a thin letter, clean-edged paper, a neat red seal, quiet proof that some decisions were made far from this place. The Clearwater Mining Company wanted to purchase the water rights to the creek running along the eastern edge of the ranch, 4 times the market price. A generous offer. Caleb Whitmore read it, folded it, and set it on the table as if placing weight directly onto his chest. Without Silver Creek, the ranch would be nothing but dry land and empty promise. He told no one, not out of fear, but habit. Caleb was used to carrying things alone. He rode all day, spoke with old neighbors, asked questions of men who had lived on this land longer than he had. The answers were the same everywhere. The mining company did not take refusals lightly. They had lawyers, money, and time. When night fell, Caleb returned. The kitchen light was still on. Naomi Brooks sat at the table, back straight, hands folded neatly before her. A pot of soup stayed warm on the stove. She did not ask where he had been nor why he was late. She simply stood, ladled a bowl, and placed it in front of him. Eat, she said. It hasn't cooled. Caleb sat, fatigue settling into his shoulders. He ate slowly, as if each spoonful needed time to pass through and their thought. Naomi did not sit across from him right away. She wiped the table, set things in order. Small tasks, just enough to leave the silence intact. There's something, Caleb said at last. Not a confession, just a statement. Naomi nodded. I know. He looked up. You were listening? The window was open, she said. Sound carries. Caleb did not argue. He took another few bites, then stopped. They want the water. Will you sell? Naomi asked, her voice even. No. The answer came faster than he expected. It's not about money. Naomi sat down then, across from him. She did not advise or analyze. She listened. Her silence did not press him, did not demand more, but Caleb spoke anyway. My father sold once, he said, eyes on the soup. After my mother died. He thought money would make the pain lighter. It didn't. Naomi did not interrupt. She placed her hand on the table, close to his, but did not touch. That small distance made Caleb more aware of her presence than any comfort would have. You're not like him, Naomi said after a moment. You're not running. Caleb gave a quiet, humorless breath. I just don't know where I'd run to. That night, he returned later than usual. The wind was cold. The moon hung low. When he opened the kitchen door, Naomi was still there, waiting, a cloth laid over a plate. The sight made him pause at the threshold longer than he meant to. You don't have to wait, he said. Naomi looked up. You need to eat. Caleb stepped forward and pulled out a chair. When she lifted the cloth, warmth rose from the food. A simple meal kept back for him. As he reached for the water, his hand brushed lightly against hers. It was only a slight touch, but it was enough. Naomi did not pull away at once. Neither did Caleb. The feeling was not loud, not hurried. It was there, quiet, as if it had existed already and had only just been noticed. Caleb released first, as though afraid of crossing a line. They sat in silence. No one spoke of the mining company. No one asked what tomorrow would bring. The oil lamp trembled softly with the night wind, their shadows stretching along the wall, closer than they truly were. Caleb stood first. "You should rest." Naomi nodded. "You should too." He stepped outside, but this time he did not feel lighter. The quiet behind him was no longer the familiar emptiness. It had thickened, filled with what had not been said, and for the first time, Caleb Whitmore understood. Some threats did not come from beyond the ranch fence, but from the moment he began to care about the woman waiting for him beneath the kitchen lamp. Pressure did not sleep. It lay somewhere between the endless fence lines and the creek that could be taken at any time. That night, Caleb Whitmore returned to the ranch after the clock had passed midnight. Cold wind moved across the empty yard. The light in the kitchen was still on. He paused for a beat, like a man who needed to give himself a reason. Then he pushed the door open. Naomi Brooks sat at the table, back straight, though her shoulders were tired. A cup of coffee sat before her, already cold. She did not ask why he was late. She did not reproach him. She only looked at him the way one looks at something already decided. The quiet in the kitchen was not empty. It was full, heavy, and real. "Have you eaten?" she asked. Caleb shook his head. She stood, lifted the lid from the pot, and ladled soup into a bowl. Nothing elaborate. No careful words. Just what needed to be done at this hour. He sat and ate slowly. Naomi sat across from him, both hands resting on the table, as if holding the room in place. "They'll come back tomorrow," Caleb said, his voice rough. "Lawyers, papers." Naomi nodded. "I know. I may lose a lot." "You won't lose what you're holding," she said, quiet but certain. He looked at her. This time, there was no escape in the look. No question safe enough to ask. No answer small enough to hide behind. Caleb set the spoon down. His hand rested on the table. Naomi placed hers nearby. The distance between them was so small it did not require a reason. When their hands touched, it was not a decision. It was an admission. Naomi did not pull away. Neither did Caleb. Warmth passed through skin, slow, as if asking permission. He stood, and this time she stood with him. No one said should. No one said shouldn't. Caleb slipped his arm around her back, hesitating for one brief beat, long enough for her to lean into him. The embrace came naturally, without urgency. Like shelter both had been seeking for a long time. Naomi rested her forehead against his shoulder. Caleb closed his arms, firm but not claiming. In that moment, the noise of the world receded. There was only breath meeting breath, slowing, deepening. They did not speak of what would follow. They stayed. The night stretched without needing to be measured. The oil lamp was turned low. The wind outside faded. Caleb realized that for the first time in many years, he was not guarding against his fear. Naomi was there. No demands, no escape. Just there, as a clear choice. When exhaustion finally arrived, they did not separate. No promises were made. No names were spoken. Some things, once said aloud, become fragile. Morning came gently. Thin light filtered through the kitchen window. Caleb woke first, listening to the breathing beside him. Naomi slept peacefully, her face calm, as if nothing remained to be defended. He sat up slowly, afraid to disturb the moment. But Naomi opened her eyes and looked at him, Without surprise, no greetings were exchanged, no smiles. Only a look held long enough for both to understand. The night before had not been a mistake. It had been a choice. Caleb stood and made coffee. Naomi sat up and adjusted her dress. They drank together in silence. This silence was different from those before. Not heavy, not guarded. It was the silence of people who had seen one another and chosen not to turn away. Outside, Whitmore Ranch woke as it always did. But in the small kitchen, they both understood that certain lines had been crossed, quietly, without display, simply by staying together when there was nothing left to avoid. Change did not arrive as a spoken admission. It came in the way Caleb Whitmore stepped into the yard that morning, his back a little straighter, his eyes no longer turning away when Naomi passed him. There were no grand gestures, nothing an outsider would notice. But for him, everything was different. Whitmore Ranch woke as it always did. Horses were let out. Cowboys pulled on their boots and moved with purpose. Breakfast was served on time. Naomi moved through the kitchen with her familiar calm. Caleb stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching it all without the old feeling that he was merely standing apart from it. He entered the kitchen while Naomi was rearranging a flour bin. "They'll be back," he said. No delay. No keeping it to himself. "The mining company." Naomi nodded. "When?" "In a few days. They want the water rights. Without Silver Creek, this ranch won't hold." She set the bin down and turned to face him. "You won't sell." It wasn't a question. Caleb recognized that, and instead of feeling cornered, he felt seen. "No," he said, "no matter what." Naomi didn't urge him to compromise. She didn't offer solutions. She simply stayed, close enough that he didn't have to carry the decision alone. In her presence, he understood something clearly. Avoidance was no longer an option. Not with the ranch. Not with her. That afternoon, Caleb rode along the creek, watching the water move over stone and grass. Silver Creek was quiet, but steady. It sustained everything around it. He thought of his father, of the times he had chosen retreat out of fear of losing more. And for the first time, Caleb saw it plainly. He had lived too long by avoiding what mattered. When he returned, Naomi was working in the small plot behind the kitchen. The soil had been turned. Empty rows waited for seed. Caleb paused, then walked over. "What do you plan to plant?" "Vegetables first," Naomi said, "then herbs." "You think you'll stay long enough to harvest?" Naomi looked up. Her gaze didn't waver. "If it's chosen." The answer held him still. Evening came slowly. A light wind moved through the yard. After supper, Naomi remained at the table mending an old dress. Caleb sat across from her, not because he needed to speak, but because he didn't want to be anywhere else. "There's something you don't know," Naomi said, without lifting her head. "About why I left town." Caleb waited. He did not rush her. "There was someone pursuing me," she continued. "Not kindly. His family had money, influence. When I refused, things became hard to breathe." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "They pressured you?" Naomi nodded slightly. "Not with hands, with circumstances." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He knew what that kind of pressure looked like. "You don't owe anyone your consent," he said, low and firm. Naomi looked at him. This time, something in her eyes softened. "I know," she said, "but not everyone is willing to say that." Caleb stood. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that his words carried weight. "Here," he said, "no one gets to force you." Naomi didn't thank him. She only nodded. the way someone acknowledges a promise. Outside, Whitmore Ranch still faced the threat of losing its water. More letters would come. Men in clean coats would return. But in that small kitchen, Caleb Whitmore understood that he had changed in a way that could not be undone. He no longer avoided what frightened him. Not conflict, not attachment. And when Naomi rose and stepped outside with him, Caleb knew with certainty, whatever tomorrow brought, he would not turn away again. Not from the ranch, and not from the woman who had chosen to stay here, when she could just as easily have gone somewhere else. They arrived at midday, when the sun stood high and Whitmore Ranch was running at its strongest. 3 horses stopped at the main porch, a thin layer of dust settling over leather boots, polished far too carefully for a place like this. Caleb Whitmore was reviewing delivery ledgers when Hank announced the visitors. Hank's voice dropped by instinct, the tone of a man who had seen too many troubles arrive wearing clean coats. The man in front introduced himself with a bow just polite enough to pass. A representative of the Clearwater Mining Company. Behind him stood a lawyer, and a woman dressed with precision, her gaze sharp as a blade. Caleb did not invite them to sit. He stayed where he was, forcing them to speak first. "We've come for a final discussion," the representative said. "About the water rights." Caleb shook his head. "There is no final discussion." The kitchen door opened behind him. Naomi Brooks stepped out, her hands still marked with garden soil. She stopped when she saw them. In that moment, Caleb noticed a subtle change in her. Not open fear, but a tightening in her eyes, like someone recognizing an old danger. The third man stepped forward half a pace. He looked at Naomi, then smiled, a familiar smile, worn by men who believe they are entitled. "It's been a while," he said, using her name as if that alone could pull her back. Naomi did not answer. She stood still, shoulders straight. Caleb stepped forward without looking to her for permission. He placed himself between Naomi and the man, close enough to leave no doubt about his choice. "She has no business with you," Caleb said. "Anything here is between me and your company." The man's mouth curved. "We know her connections, and we know you're under pressure." Heat rose in Caleb's chest, but his voice remained level. "You're standing on my land. If you have no other business, you can leave." The lawyer stepped forward, lifting a folder of papers. "We only want you to review. These terms are very—" "No," Caleb cut in. "And if you think you can use anyone here to force my hand, you've chosen the wrong place." Silence stretched. The man who had pursued Naomi tilted his head, his eyes sliding past Caleb's shoulder, searching for an opening. There was none. Caleb stood firm, like a newly set fence needing no threats. Naomi spoke then, her voice steady in a way that surprised even herself. "I've already said it," she said, looking directly at the man. "I'm not going back, and I don't belong to any agreement you're making." The man gave a soft laugh. "Everyone has a price." Caleb turned fully toward him for the first time. "She isn't for sale." The words landed heavily. The woman with them frowned slightly. The lawyer lowered his papers. They understood now. This would not be an easy negotiation. "We'll return," the representative said, his tone no longer polite. "With people who have authority." "Do that," Caleb replied. "The gate's over there." As they turned their horses and rode away, Naomi remained where she was. Caleb didn't ask questions. He waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded, then turned back to her. She let out a breath, light and controlled, like someone who had been holding it too long. "Are you all right?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "I thought I would shake," she said, "but I didn't." Caleb looked at her and saw not just courage, but release. Here, he said. No one gets to call your name and drag you back. Naomi looked at him longer than necessary. You didn't hesitate, she said. No, Caleb answered. I already chose. The afternoon passed slowly. The ranch continued its work as if nothing had happened. But for Caleb, a line had been drawn, not only with the mining company, but within himself. He had chosen to stand in front of her, and realized it was the easiest choice he had ever made. As the sun softened, Naomi returned to the garden. Caleb followed, helping her reset a small fence the wind had shifted. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Some things had already been settled through action. Night fell. The kitchen light came on again. This time, Caleb did not stand outside watching. He was there, beside Naomi, inside the space they had chosen to protect, against those who wanted to claim everything, and against the old fear that had once driven her away. They left Whitmore Ranch early, thin fog resting on the grass like a temporary cover for what had not yet been spoken. Caleb drove the wagon at an easy pace, not pressing the horses. Naomi sat beside him, back straight, hands folded on her skirt. The road back to the old town was not long, but it was long enough for memory to begin speaking. Clearwater appeared different from what Naomi remembered. Louder, rougher. The sound of hammers and metal striking metal carried from the mining site at the edge of town. New signs stood beside freshly painted storefronts, but behind them were cracked walls left unchanged. Caleb recognized the pattern at once. Growth without security, expansion carrying pressure rather than relief. Naomi's family boarding house sat at the far end of the main street. When the wagon stopped, she stepped down first. She paused, looking at the two-story building with windows partially boarded over. Paint peeled from the walls. The porch sagged to one side. This was not decay from age, but neglect applied with intent. The door opened. Her father stepped out. He looked older than Naomi remembered. Thinner shoulders, slower movement. But when he saw his daughter, his face softened at once. Naomi, he said, his voice unsteady. She crossed the space quickly and embraced him. Caleb stayed back, giving them the moment. Inside the boarding house, the air smelled damp. Several rooms stood empty. Some tables and chairs were gone, leaving bare patches on the floor. Caleb looked around, fitting together what he had already heard. They come often, Naomi's father said as he poured tea. Not always the same men, but always the same message. Naomi sat across from him, listening. They say if I sell, things will ease, he went on. If I don't, accidents happen. Accidents, Naomi repeated quietly. Windows broken with stones. A small fire in the storage room late at night. Guests get scared. They leave. He lowered his gaze. Nothing that can be proven. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. What price did they offer? Low, the old man said, but with conditions. He looked up at Naomi. They want you back in town, want you to settle. Silence settled between them. Naomi drew a slow breath. I said no. I know, her father replied quickly, but they aren't used to refusal. Caleb stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street. People passed without looking up. This kind of threat survived on public indifference. They're trying to force a choice, Caleb said. Sell or lose everything. Naomi's father nodded. I thought about signing, not for the money, for you. Naomi rose to her feet. You don't owe them me, she said. And I didn't come back to be used as leverage. Caleb turned, his voice steady. We won't let this stay quiet. He looked at her father. Do you have anything in writing? Letters? Records? The old man hesitated, then opened a drawer and took out a thin stack of papers. Not much, he said, but enough to show how often they came. Naomi touched the papers as if touching proof of sleepless nights. I'm sorry I left, she said softly. No, he replied. You did right. Outside, the afternoon leaned toward evening. Caleb stepped onto the porch and breathed deeply. He understood now this was not just about a ranch or a boarding house. It was about how people were pushed from what they had built over a lifetime. He turned back to Naomi. We'll meet them, he said. Not here. Naomi met his eyes. No hesitation left in hers. Where? Where they think they hold control, Caleb answered. When they left the boarding house, Naomi looked back once. Not with fear, but with resolve. The old town no longer had the power to pull her back. It was a place where the truth needed to be brought into the open. And this time, she was not returning alone. The hotel parlor sat on the second floor, its window looking down onto Clearwater's main street. A dining table stood dressed in a white cloth far too clean for this town, a quiet reminder that power prefers to appear orderly. Caleb Whitmore arrived early. He remained standing. Naomi Brooks sat beside her father, back straight, hands resting still on her lap. No one spoke until the door opened. They entered together. The mining company's representative, the lawyer, the man who had once pursued Naomi. The arrangement was deliberate. Authority in the center, threat at the edges, courtesy on the outside. Caleb took them in with a brief glance, then turned his gaze to the window. He had not come to be staged. We should begin, the lawyer said, his voice even, like a report being read. The purpose of today's meeting is to clarify two matters: the Silver Creek water rights and the transfer of property in Clearwater. Caleb did not answer at once. He looked to Naomi. She gave a small nod, a sign of readiness. He turned back. Go on. Papers were laid out. Old maps, faded lines. The lawyer spoke of boundaries, precedent, shared benefit. Caleb listened without interrupting. He waited for the moment that mattered. When Naomi's turn came, the man spoke before anyone else, his tone smooth, clinging. Miss Brooks, we believe you understand your father's situation. A cooperative decision would allow things to settle quietly. Naomi lifted her head. This time she did not remain silent. I understand very clearly, she said. I understand that when we refused, windows were broken, a storage room burned, guests were threatened. I understand that those were not accidents. The lawyer shifted slightly. Those are serious allegations. No, Naomi said. They're facts. The room fell quiet. Caleb felt the pivot. He placed his hand on the table and stepped forward half a pace. We have records, he said. Dates, visits, letters, and we have filed a request to review the water boundaries based on updated survey maps. The lawyer frowned. That process will take time. We have time, Caleb said. You don't. The man gave a thin smile. You're risking your ranch for what's right, Caleb cut in, and for people. He did not look at Naomi when he said it, but she knew. The room was no longer about numbers. It became a place of choice. The company representative's voice hardened. You're refusing a very favorable offer. Caleb nodded. Yes. You'll lose a great deal. Possibly, he replied, but not what I need to keep. Naomi stood. She was not taller than anyone there, but when she rose, no one remained seated in ease. I will not return to this town to be used as leverage, she said, her voice clear. And I will not stay silent so that silence can serve you. The man looked at her, his gaze darkening. Caleb stepped forward and took the space between them. No hesitation, no calculation. This meeting is over, he said. Any further communication will go through our council. They left the room in a heavy quiet. In the hallway, Naomi released a breath, like someone coming off a long incline. Caleb did not ask if she was all right. He knew the answer. He opened the door and let the light in. Outside, the town was still loud, but their steps were steady. Caleb realized that for the first time, he had not weighed cost before standing in defense. He had chosen, not by calculation, but because there was no other path he could accept. As they descended the stairs, Naomi looked at him. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. Caleb shook his head. I did. And in that moment, amid the mixed noise of Clearwater, his choice became clearer than any map or clause ever could. Victory did not come with cheers. It arrived on a windless afternoon, with Caleb Whitmore standing alone beside Silver Creek, watching the water move over familiar stones. The creek was still there, not fenced, not diverted, no new markers driven into the ground. It simply flowed, steady as it had long before there was a ranch, before there were men who believed everything could be bought. The news came plainly. The mining company withdrew. The file was suspended without a timeline. The offers ended. No apology, no admission of fault. Only silence, the kind kept by those who know they have lost and do not wish it spoken aloud. Caleb closed his hands, then let them fall open. He did not feel the relief he had imagined. There was no sense of triumph the way frontier men like to tell it in saloons. Only a slow clarity settling in his chest. If that day he had stood alone, this ranch, this creek, perhaps he still would have won. But there would have been no one to return to. The thought turned him back toward Whitmore Ranch as the sun dropped lower. A thin ribbon of kitchen smoke lifted into the air. The familiar smell of baking bread carried on the wind. Naomi Brooks stood outside the kitchen, hands dusted with flour, her skirt tied back. She looked up at the sound of his horse, her eyes meeting his. No questions were needed. She saw the answer on his face before he spoke. They've withdrawn, Caleb said. Naomi paused for a breath. Then she nodded. No wide smile. No celebration. Just a quiet exhale, like someone setting down a weight carried too long. So it's over. Caleb stepped closer. This time there was no distance to keep. No, he said. It isn't. Naomi looked at him, her head tilting slightly. What do you mean? He glanced around the kitchen, the place that had once been nothing more than a way to fill men before work. Now it held rhythm, warmth, and the woman standing before him was no longer someone he could think of as temporary. I thought this ranch was the most important thing in my life, Caleb said slowly. The land, the water, the cattle. I lived for it, and I was willing to lose everything else to keep it. Naomi remained silent, letting him speak. But when I imagined winning, he continued, his voice lowering, and coming back alone, I understood something. This ranch means nothing if you're not here. There was no flourish in the words, no practiced line, only a truth that had surfaced, clear enough that it could not be avoided. Naomi studied him for a long moment. There was no shock in her eyes, no surprise. Only the familiar weighing, like the look she had worn the first day she stepped down from the wagon, measuring this place as one measures a life. "Caleb," she said, using his name without hesitation for the first time. "Are you certain you're choosing me, and not choosing the feeling of victory?" He shook his head. "I've already won," he said, "and I know now that winning alone isn't enough." He did not kneel. He did not produce a ring. There was no proposal as stories like to tell them. Caleb simply stood there, his work-worn hands opening before her, as if laying down everything he had, and everything he no longer wished to keep for himself. "I won't promise what I'm not sure I can give," he said. "This land is harsh. So am I. But if you choose to stay, not as hired help, but as the person I choose, I won't turn away." Naomi stepped forward. One step, then another. She looked at his hands, then placed her own in them. No trembling, no delay. "I don't need a ring," she said. "I need to know I'm not the choice you make because you're afraid of being alone." Caleb closed his hands around hers, firm and certain. "You're the choice I make because I'm no longer running." No one witnessed the moment. No music, no vows. Only the late light settling into the small kitchen, where at last both of them understood that what mattered most was not land or water, but the person willing to stay when every battle had ended. Naomi nodded, just once, but it was enough. Outside, Whitmore Ranch still stood, unchanged. Yet Caleb Whitmore knew, from this moment on, everything he protected had meaning, because he was no longer doing it alone. The wedding took place on a windless morning. There was no church, no music, only the yard in front of the ranch house, where sunlight spread evenly across ground still holding the night's dew. A wooden arch stood there, built by hands more used to labor than decoration. A few bundles of wildflowers were tied with rope. Everything was so simple there was almost nothing to display, except that two people had chosen to stand beside one another. Naomi Brooks stepped out from the kitchen, the place that had been the center of the ranch long before it had a family. Her wedding dress was not something elaborately made, just a light-colored dress, clean, well-fitted, easy to walk in without lifting the hem. Her hair was pinned back neatly, no jewelry, no veil. She walked with the steady gait of someone who knew where she belonged. Caleb Whitmore waited at the front. He wore a clean shirt, his coat brushed smooth, but he was still the same man, a prairie man unused to grand words. When Naomi reached him, Caleb said nothing for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. She placed hers in it, without hesitation. There were few witnesses. Hank, a handful of cowboys who had chosen to stay. Naomi's father stood slightly behind, his eyes damp, his face eased like a man setting down a burden carried too long. No explanations were needed. They understood. This was not a marriage of survival, nor a compromise. It was a choice. The vows were brief, no promises that stretched beyond what a person could give. Only Caleb saying he would not leave, and Naomi saying she would stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she wanted to. When the small gathering dispersed, Whitmore Ranch returned to its familiar rhythm, but it was no longer the same. The main house door stood open more often. Windows were no longer shut tight. In the kitchen, the smell of bread spread each morning, not to keep hired hands working, but to feed a family. Naomi planted more around the garden, slowly, sparingly. Rows of vegetables came up in steady order. Caleb repaired fences, replaced boards worn thin. Small tasks, repeated, but carrying different meaning. The ranch was no longer something to be defended at all cost. It was something to be cared for. In the evenings, they sat on the porch. They did not always talk. Some days were too tiring for words to matter, but the presence of the other was no longer something to be guarded against. It was assumed. Caleb realized he no longer saw the ranch as a fortress. He saw it as a home, a place one returned to, not to prove strength, but to be oneself without defense. Naomi changed as well, quietly. She no longer moved like someone ready to leave at any moment. She reorganized drawers, hung curtains, set small things in fixed places, the gestures of someone who was not passing through. One afternoon, Caleb stood beside Silver Creek, watching the water move. Naomi joined him. No one spoke of the past. No one spoke of what had almost been lost. They simply stood there together, looking at the water, the thing that had once been the cause of so much struggle, now just part of the living landscape. "Do you think," Naomi said, "if I hadn't stepped down from that wagon, things would have been different?" Caleb thought for a moment. "The ranch might still be here," he said, "but I'm not sure I would be." Naomi nodded. She understood. Life on the frontier promised nothing easy. But the most important thing, both Caleb and Naomi knew, was this. They had not arrived here by luck. They had come through a series of choices, choosing not to leave, choosing not to stay silent, choosing to stand with one another when it offered no immediate advantage. Whitmore Ranch still stood on the wide prairie, but now it was more than land and water. It was proof of a simple truth not everyone dares to believe. Staying is not something that happens by chance. Staying is a choice. If this story stirred a memory, a thought, or even just a faint warmth within you, we invite you to leave a few lines in the comments and share it with others. If you felt your heart grow a little calmer, please press like to support the channel. And if you wish to keep walking with us through slow, thoughtful stories about family, about staying, and about the choices that shape a life, you are warmly invited to subscribe. Thank you for staying with us until the final lines.